Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Before I start, I think it's only fair that when you come to listen to somebody lecture on anything, they should tell you who they are and why they're a fit person to lecture. Then you know that what you might not know, that people who are talking to you have any sort of experience or expertise in the area. So I left Nottingham University finally in 1972. I studied here. I did my BSc in geology, which you can't do anymore at Nottingham University because the geology department is long gone, and I did a PhD in geology and geochemistry here, and I left, as I say, in 1992, and since 1972, and since that date I've worked in the energy sector, and for a lot of that time, more than the majority of that time, I've worked in the nuclear sector. A lot of it in the public sector, but also partly in industry. And for 10 years of that time, of my work experience, I was responsible in the European Commission for radioactive waste management in Europe, in the EU, and decommissioning of nuclear facilities. So nuclear is something I know quite a lot about, and especially on the waste issue I know even more. Okay, so I have an energy background, but with a concentration in the nuclear sector. So that's me. This is basically what I'll talk about. A few words about energy policy, because I'm an energy policy person at heart. The role of nuclear in the European Union, surveys of public opinion, keeping the lights on, some words on the costs of electricity, responding to the spectre of climate change, which is very important. Energy and climate change are very intermixed now. You can't separate the two. And also, what about the waste? What about nuclear waste, the big issue? And then give some summary and conclusions. And hopefully by the end of this, after you've listened to this and thought about it, you make up your own mind as to whether we should have nuclear energy or not. Now, energy policy, all energy policies are made up of three key objectives. In order to be a good energy policy, you need to get the right balance between security of supply, availability, you want uninterrupted supplies of energy. When you turn on the light, you want it to come on. You don't want to stay in the dark. Competitiveness, that means can we afford it, and what's more, can industry afford it, and may keep it competitive. So you need a competitive economic supply of energy, and it's got to be sustainable. It's no good something that will last a year and then never use again. You want it to be sustainable throughout your lifetime and the lifetime of future generations, and so you don't want it to have a negative impact on the environment, or to minimize the impact on the environment. And to get a balance between those three key objectives is what is critical. It's no point having one objective and not meeting the other two. And I refer to it as always a three-legged stool, the energy policy. It's no good having one which is much longer than the other two, because the stool will fall over. No good having one which is much weaker, then it will break and fall over. So you need to have a good balance between the three objectives of energy policy. Okay, that's energy policy. Public perception of nuclear energy in the European Union, the EU, the European Union. Most of what I will talk about is the European Union. I've worked in the European Union. I still live in Europe. You're all living in Europe, of course, at the moment, but I live in what the British regard as Europe, which is on the continent, where I live and work for the last nearly 40 years now. But public perception is a key issue. It's a key issue for nuclear, because it determines the position taken by a lot of politicians. If they think the public hate nuclear, no politician's going to stand up and say, I like it, because it's a vote loser. So if there's a strong negative movement against nuclear, the politicians will probably vote against it. Now, since the 1970s, so for the last 45 years or so now, the European Commission has conducted community-wide public opinion surveys. And it's included on nuclear energy, nuclear safety, radioactive waste in particular. And there are two very clear conclusions you can draw. One, asked about nuclear, the majority of the public say they're concerned about it. The majority of the public say they're concerned about nuclear. But it's also very clear the public is very poorly informed about nuclear. They don't know very much about it at all, but they're very concerned. Okay? It's a strange dilemma in some ways, but they're concerned but know very little. For those academics amongst us, and hopefully there's quite a few here, if you ever want to find a PhD student something to do, set them to look at the Eurobarometer, because there are surveys that cover every possible subject you can think of in Europe, and these Eurobarometers are a massive source of some fabulous data which have never been properly mined. So data mining of the Eurobarometer surveys would be great PhD theses. People who do not believe that they're well informed about radioactive waste. That is true, people know they're not well informed, and only a very small percentage know anything about radioactive waste, for example. Okay? 45% are not well informed, and other 29% are not informed at all. Therefore, 3/4 of the population don't feel informed about radioactive waste, or about nuclear at all. And a couple of examples there. 28% of people in Greece believe that nuclear power plants are operating in their country. Greece has never, ever had a nuclear power plant. But more than one person in 4 believes they have them operating in Greece. 24% of Italians, nearly 1 in 4 of Italians, believe nuclear power plants are operating in their countries. All their nuclear power plants stopped in 1986 after the Chernobyl accident. Okay, so they haven't had nuclear power plants operating for nearly 30 years, but 1/4 of Italians still believe they have nuclear power plants operating. When we ask people about nuclear energy, what comes to mind, risks or benefits? Okay, risks outweigh the benefits. That is the majority opinion. Surprisingly enough, it's not quite as strong as a lot of us expected. We thought a lot of people, more than 51% would say the risks outweigh the benefits. But it was all about 50%, and 35% said the benefits outweigh the risks. So it wasn't that bad, but the majority of people still feel the risks outweigh the benefits. However, we asked them what they thought the benefits were. Now, clearly people agree that nuclear makes us less dependent on imports. They agree on this. This is something they agree, which is important. This is security of supply. They also believe, the majority also believe, it gives us more competitive energy prices, nuclear, than alternatives. So they're quite happy on those two benefits. And there's even a majority, but not a very big majority, say it helps against climate change. Now it's this last one here, helps against climate change, that probably worries me most, because people should know more about that than they clearly do. But we'll come to that in a moment. There are a lot of regional variations within Europe, by the way. Some of you might not know, Europe is very diverse. So you see, the Hungarians, 81% think nuclear gives us greater diversification, but only 38% of Austrians. 83% of Swedes think it reduces our dependence on other external sources, but only 39% of Austrians. So Austrians clearly don't like nuclear, but the Hungarians and Swedes do. They think it's got good benefits. The Austrians don't think so. Does not emit CO2. We're back to this question again. Fight against climate change. 85% of Swedes accept that it doesn't emit CO2, but only 35% of the people in Cyprus. 49% of the people in Cyprus don't know whether it does or not. and 16% disagree. So there's very big regional variations in Europe. So you've got to be careful with your statistics occasionally. These are countries, surprisingly, in favour of nuclear energy. Start with the Czech Republic, the Lithuanians, the Hungarians, the Swedes, the Finns, the Slovakians, all at least 60% of the population favour nuclear. And then it goes down gradually until the European average is 44%, but every one of these countries on the left here has nuclear reactors. Most of the ones to the right of the European average do not have nuclear reactors, basically. So if you have nuclear power plants in your country, you're generally in favour of nuclear power. If you don't have them, you don't understand the benefits. The poorest informed are most likely to react the most negatively to questions concerning nuclear. And nuclear clearly causes least concern in those countries where the options have been well discussed and debated. So the message here is clear. Discuss and debate as much as possible with people who want to know about it. And it also helps if a clear and firm decision has been taken on the way forward. Politicians are very difficult with clear and firm decisions, because especially on nuclear. And so often in the past, especially in the UK, I believe, they've changed their mind and gone backwards again. They go forwards, then backwards, forwards and backwards. And this puts the public in a quandary and makes them think, well, if the politicians don't know what to do, we'd better be careful and not do anything. So it's very, very dangerous. And my personal opinion, from reviewing all this information, and I've looked at the Eurobarometer surveys since the 1970s, done a lot of studying of these surveys, I don't believe the public are, in general, that agitated about the nuclear question, unless you ask them about it. What I mean is, if you go and ask somebody in the street, pick somebody in the street and say, what are your major 10 concerns? Nuclear will not be amongst them. You can ask them what their major 50 concerns are, and you'll be lucky to find nuclear listed in that 50. Because they don't think about it. But if you say, what do you think about nuclear? Oh, I'm worried. But they don't worry from day to day. It's not something that preys on people's minds. But they believe they should be worried, rather than the fact that they are. Nuclear energy, until recently, produced 1/3 of all the electricity in the European Union. It's dropped now to about 27%, mainly because the reactor closures started in Germany, mainly after Fukushima. But personally, I would expect nuclear to maintain its share in the medium to long term. I don't think it's going to drop a lot more, that Germany will close its reactors, but there will be some new reactors built in Europe. So I don't think in the medium to long term that share is going to decrease noticeably. And there's a possibility, from listening to what the G7 leaders say, that it could even increase again. We will certainly have nuclear power plants operating well into the second half of the century and probably well beyond. So I don't think it will go away. It's just a matter of how big a share it will take. And personally, I think at least 30% share in electricity would be preferred. This is the present share by fuel, just a pictorial representation of the share of the different sources of energy in our electricity supply. And you see nuclear is the single largest part of it, and which lead its shares with coal quite often, and sometimes they change from one to the other, but in theory coal share should decrease more quickly now than the nuclear share. Renewables looks to be quite a lot, it's 24.3%, but this is not all wind power, as some people would have you believe. Only 11% of the total of the 24% is wind power, so less than 3% of the European electricity supply comes from wind, and half of that from solar at the moment in time. The majority is from biomass, which is from, a lot of it is from burning the wood, from the paper when they cut down the wood and used for paper, and used for, of course, to use as wood for building materials, this waste material is then burnt as fuel, and that is the type of thing that biomass, which is used in power plants, and that is the major source of the renewable energy in Europe at this present time. This is who produces the electricity. These are the countries. The biggest electricity, nuclear electricity producer on the left, is clear, is France. They have over 70% of their electricity is nuclear, and after that there's a gradually decreasing share. Germany is the second biggest at the present time, but of course they're scheduled to close all their reactors in the next 7 years. Then the UK, then Sweden, and these are all people with nuclear shares. There's more countries than this, but they have smaller amount of nuclear power at the moment in time. 14 of the member states in total have nuclear energy at this moment. So returning to energy policy, I said there are 3 key objectives: security of supply, competitiveness and sustainability. Security of supply issue. Keeping the lights on. The EU is a major importer of energy. We import more than half of the energy we use in Europe. More than half of our energy comes from outside of Europe. Hard coal, 63% of our hard coal is imported, 86% of our oil is imported, and 66%, 2/3 of our gas is imported. And the numbers in brackets are the share of those imports from Russia. From Russia. Russia is by far Europe's largest supplier of energy. It provides more inputs of coal, oil and gas than any other source. We get more oil, coal and gas from Russia than from any other source. UK's energy dependence, this is the only UK slide I think I put up, and this shows that UK's energy dependency has almost doubled in the speed of 4 years. So we're getting more dependent on imports. So why worry? Well, coal, gas and oil together produce about 50% of the electricity in the European Union. 50% of our electricity comes from coal, oil and gas, and we import around 2/3 of that coal, oil and gas. Okay, so 1/3 of our electricity relies heavily on imports. 1/3 of our electricity relies heavily on imports, and a lot of those imports come from Russia. Okay, and our electricity demand will increase, and the imported share of it will increase. We'll become increasingly dependent in the future on imported energy sources. Nuclear is not an imported energy source. It's very difficult or impossible for a third country to interrupt the EU's supply of renewables or of nuclear energy. And nuclear energy can be regarded as an indigenous source of energy. Even if we now import most of the base material, which is uranium, all the processes by which it's turned from basic material into fuel are done within Europe. We've mastered the full nuclear fuel cycle. Full nuclear fuel cycle. So we make our own fuel. And it's a very dense fuel. It's an energy dense material. We can extract enormous quantities from 1 kilogram of uranium. 1 kilogram you can hold easily in one hand. We can extract enormous quantities of energy from it. And it's safe and very easy to transport. You can fly it all over the world if you wish. And ship it in the back of your car. It's easy to stockpile many years of future supplies as a raw material, enriched, already fabricated into fuel. You can keep it for a long time at a very reasonable cost. And once a reactor is fueled, once you put the fuel in the reactor and started it up, it can run for many months or even years without any more fuel going into it. So once you've fueled the reactor, you can walk away for the next 18 months, 2 years, and just let it go. We don't. We move things around a bit, and we put new fuel in, take some out, and things like this in order to keep the efficiency up. But we can do it. And as I said, the G7 expects the Western world to rely on nuclear and renewables by the end of the century, because it makes us all independent, makes Europe independent. If we have nuclear and renewables in Europe, nobody can cut off our fuel supplies, our energy supplies. Energy policy, competitiveness, okay, the second of the legs of the stool. Affordability. We all know that nuclear energy is expensive, don't we? I think we do, but that is true for all forms of electricity. In fact, my former commissioner in the European Commission always said that electricity everywhere was too cheap. We should pay a lot more for it. We're getting it too cheap as an energy source. But none of them are very cheap. And if we wish to compare technologies, we need to compare the costs over the full lifetime of the plant which is producing it. Not just over the first 2 years or the last 2 years, but over the full lifetime of the plant. Include all your building costs, all your maintenance costs, all your operating costs, and all your closure costs, and your waste costs. So you've got to do the full thing, and the way it's normally done is by comparing what are called levelized costs of the electricity, LCOE. The most widely quoted, used and quoted for levelized costs are those produced by the International Energy Agency and the Nuclear Energy Agency of the OECD in Paris. And the seventh in the series of reports was published in 2010, and the eighth one is in preparation, I believe. Should be due out later this year. While the number varied over the actual numbers have varied over the 7 issues, the general conclusions remain the same, and this figure is taken from the 7th issue. This was the 2010, and these are for levelized costs of electricity from different types of plants that would have been decided on in 2010 to be operational as soon around 2015. This, i.e. the prices that are quoted to construct these plants in 2010. And these are the costs, and you see, I put a star against the nuclear so you can see them easier. The cost of nuclear is the lowest of all the different sources. And this is a similar thing from earlier reports. Now, I have to give some balance. I did look at the Institute of Energy Research, where they had a more recent report, and these are fixed operating and maintenance, fixed operational and maintenance costs, which includes construction, and the variable part, and you see the light blue part is the fixed cost of constructing the equipment, and the darker blue part is the variable operating and maintenance costs, of course, which includes, for example, for coal, it includes fuel, and for gas, it includes fuel. Now, in this one, the levelized costs for advanced nuclear, so this is a newer plant, these are plants that would be operating in 2019, is more expensive than, for example, the combined cycle. But this is using American gas prices. This is using American gas prices, which are far lower, of course, than the gas prices we have in Europe, because of the shale gas boom in North America, which pulled down gas prices dramatically. So basically, nuclear is very competitive on costs and over a lifetime of its operation. Very expensive to build, but cheap to run. The third leg of energy policy is sustainability, and where you're looking for the lowest possible negative impact on the environment. As I say, this was an issue that bothered me a bit, because when you asked if it helped to fight against climate change, less than half the people agreed, and nearly 40% of them didn't agree, and a lot didn't know. These are the carbon emissions per kilowatt hour of electricity produced, and by different sources: coal, oil, natural gas, renewables, and nuclear. Okay? So the nuclear is the last one on the line, and the lowest CO2. People say, well, renewable costs. You can't do that for renewables because, of course, wind and solar don't produce much carbon dioxide, which is true, at least true once you've built them. But a lot of the renewable sources comes from biomass, as I said earlier, which does produce quite a bit of carbon dioxide. So the green variation depends on the different generating technologies. So you can have a very small CO2 from renewables, of course, but also quite a noticeable one. So nuclear is the least CO2 on average of the major sources. It's a purely factual statement that nuclear power plant does not emit CO2 during its operation. Nuclear power plants do not emit CO2 during operation. In addition, from the point of view of sustainability, mining operations are very small, with a very limited footprint, a very small area. Uranium mines are very small. The total world production of uranium is around 60,000 tons a year. That's the full world uranium supply production at this moment is 60,000 tons a year. It's not a large amount, especially when you're not digging much rock up, especially when you can get deposits with 20 or even 30% uranium in the deposit. So you're not moving a great deal of rock to get to that. So your mining footprint is very small. Your transport footprint is very small. Nuclear power plant does not release radioactive waste into the environment. Practically all nuclear wastes are contained. There are some allowed radioactive emissions, but these are very low and totally harmless in view of where they're dispersed to, and they don't harm anybody or any plants or any environment. Otherwise, it keeps all its waste. It contains and isolates its waste material. So all good so far. It meets the three conditions of the energy policy. The three things you want from energy policy, nuclear will meet that. All good so far. But what about all that waste? Well, okay. This is there for people who never heard of radioactive waste before. There are different types of waste. There are different types of radioactive waste. People don't know this. You ask people if they know there are different types of radioactive waste, they'll say no. It's just radioactive. Well, there are. There's what's called very low-level waste, low-level waste, intermediate-level waste, and high-level waste, basically. Some of which is what's called short-lived, some of which is long-lived. It depends on the half-lives of the products in it. So these are, you'll hear these terms again, but very low-level waste you can kind of pick up with your hand and walk around in it, doesn't matter, there's no problem. Low-level waste is very low-level waste, no issue at all. Low-level waste, you have to look after it. Intermediate-level waste starts to get a bit more dangerous till you get to the high-level waste, which is very dangerous, and you wouldn't want to sit in the same room. And this spent fuel. This is the fuel that comes, used fuel that comes out of the reactor. That's also regarded by a lot of people as waste. It's regarded as waste if we don't reprocess it. Reprocessing, I'll come to it briefly in a moment. For those of you who've never been to a nuclear facility, this is to give you an idea what it's like inside. It's the main reason for this slide, is to show you what it's like inside a nuclear plant. This is inside a nuclear power plant. One thing you will notice, this is actually at Olkiluoto in Finland. This is one of the operating boiling water reactors. The reactor is in the large pool in the middle there. And to the above that, just slightly higher, is the spent fuel pond, where when you've used the fuel, you take it out and put it in the pond, they call them ponds, next to the one that the reactor's in, to store it to cool down. Okay, one thing you will notice is, two things you should notice. One, there's hardly anybody there. I think anybody who goes to a nuclear facility, any sort of nuclear facility, is always amazed that there's nobody there. The place looks as though it's been deserted almost. It runs with very few people. You don't need people in nuclear facilities very often. A few people in a control room and that's it. You load up the fuel in a nuclear reactor and it goes. You don't have to sit and kind of watch it all the time or keep changing something all the time. A couple of people in a control room can run it. It's also spotlessly clean. Well, if you go into a nuclear facility, they will give you a coat to put on, they'll give you overshoes. That's to stop you dirtying their facility more than keeping you clean. Because these facilities are generally spotless. And they're kept that way. It's part of the culture of the nuclear industry now. It didn't used to be, but it is now, of keeping everything as spotlessly clean as possible. Do not produce waste and then you don't have to handle it. So, that's a typical inside of a typical nuclear facility. What is reprocessing? I mentioned it, and it's important in the UK because the UK has a reprocessing plant in the UK, and it's at Sellafield, which is, of course, the UK's main nuclear problem area, because everybody knows that Sellafield contains a lot of waste and a lot of problems, which is going to cost the taxpayer a lot to clean up. So, what is reprocessing that's done at Sellafield? When the nuclear fuel has been burnt in a reactor, when it's been used in a reactor, you take it out, and only a low percentage of the actual uranium has actually been used. There's about 93% of the uranium is not used in a nuclear reaction by the time the fuel is taken out. But the products, the fission products of the reaction, slow down the reaction. So you need to take it out because the fission products make it inefficient. But you can recover the unburnt uranium, this 93%. If we need no more uranium, you can recover this 93% from the fuel. And you do it by a pure chemical process. You dissolve up the fuel in acid and you separate it out chemically. And then you get unburnt uranium, and you get these fission products, which are what we call poisoning the reactor fuel. You get these fission products, which are high-level waste. These are high-level waste. We have no use for them at this moment in time, so we need to handle them. And this is the high-level waste stream. And these are the more dangerous and the more tricky things to handle, and the ones that give a lot of people something of a headache on what to do with. So how much waste do we have in the European Union? Total production of waste, radioactive waste, I've got the figures for 2007. This is because the European Commission does these figures, but they haven't done them since 2010 was the last time they did a report, and their figures were from 2007. A new report is due this year, again, hopefully, and so we'll get the new data this year, but the numbers will not have changed very much, because the nuclear production keeps about the same for all this period in time, so the year is not too relevant at the moment. Total production of waste was about 110,000 cubic meters. A large part of this was called low and intermediate level waste, short-lived low and intermediate level waste. So this is not really dangerous type of waste. It's the low radioactive waste which goes back to background material quite quickly. An almost equal amount was long-lived waste, and the majority of this is in the UK because of the UK's nuclear reactor types. The UK produces this long-lived intermediate level waste because of the types of reactors which we use in the UK, which in all situations but Sizewell B, or Sizewell C, isn't it? All except Sizewell C, all these reactors are a different type to what everybody else uses. So we produce nearly 38,000 cubic meters of this type of waste, which nobody else produces. And then there's 30,000 tons of very low-level waste, which is nearly all in France, because the French system, the French have not had a system where they can say this material was used in a nuclear facility but is not really radioactive and we can use it for something else. Every other country in Europe but in France, something that's been inside a nuclear facility but has a very low level of radioactivity that it's inconsequential, it's totally harmless, can be released into the environment and can be used for other things, or just thrown out and it just disposed of any sort of reasonable facility. But not in France. Therefore, France has a very large amount of very low-level waste, which no other country in Europe really has. And also, we have this headache of 190 cubic meters of high-level waste. This is the high-level waste. This is the ones we've got a problem to how we get rid of, which is a cube about 5 meters cubed, just between 5 and 6 meter cubed. So that's the quantity of high-level waste we produce in Europe in a year. And 2,500 tons of spent fuel, but we can either reprocess it or we dispose of the 2,500 tons directly. It's up to us, and it's not divided up in this case. Some people have not yet decided what to do with this fuel in the future. And here's a fact that a lot of people do not know. Over 2 million cubic meters of radioactive waste have already been disposed of in Europe. Over 2 million cubic meters of radioactive waste already disposed of in Europe. This is the annual waste production in figures, in a diagrammatic form. And you'll see the amount, the very slim sliver at the top is actually the high-level waste. This is the one that gives us the headache. These are the main producers of waste. You'll see France, 29,000 tons out of the 30,000, and the UK with 36,000 tons of the long-lived, low and intermediate level waste out of the 38,000. So these are the main waste producers in Europe. So, how does this compare with other sorts of waste? Well, we produce close to 3 billion tons of general waste in Europe every year. Okay, it's about 6 tons of general waste for every person in Europe. 6 tons of general waste, okay? This is stuff that you put in your rubbish bins, but is also produced on your behalf by industry, of course, during production. Over 100 million tons of hazardous waste is produced in Europe every year. 100 million tons, 200 kilograms per person in Europe of hazardous waste. This isn't radioactive waste, this is hazardous waste. Poisonous waste in particular. And actually there are over 50,000 disposal sites in the European Union at this time, over 50,000 sites, and many are what is called in critical state. They're leaking a bit, they're getting polluting local water courses and things like this. So many of them are in the critical state. So waste management in Europe is not always brilliant for other types of waste. And this is, of course, we also produce nearly 4 billion tons of carbon dioxide now, 3.65 billion tons of carbon dioxide. For energy use alone, this is for energy use, which is over 7 tons of carbon dioxide for every person in Europe. So we produce a tremendous amount of waste, but in order to produce 1/3 of all Europe's electricity, we produce 190 cubic meters of total amount of high-level waste in Europe, 190 cubic meters for 1/3 of all the electricity in Europe. Radioactive waste management, different categories of waste are stored and disposed of differently, of course, and the higher the level of the waste, the greater the effort to isolate it from the environment. the greater the effort you need to stop that infiltrating the environment and attacking man and the environment. Okay? So the more dangerous it is, the higher the level, the more radioactive it is, the longer it's radioactive for, the more effort you need to isolate it. So for the very low-level waste and low-level waste and intermediate low-level waste, which is short-lived, remember the slide I put up earlier on? These are the lower levels, are disposed of at or very near the surface. And they're frequently disposed of together, all three of them, or at least two of them, disposed of together, at or near the surface. The high-level waste will be disposed of in deep geological formations. It will go underground, deep underground, where you've got a nice thick barrier of rock, usually 400 or 500 meters or anything up to 1 kilometer of rock between the waste and the surface. You don't need that much because of the radioactivity, of course. That can be done in a space of 1 meter of concrete. But what you do is to try and make sure you never see that again by burying it very deep. And the deeper you bury it, the less chance you ever seeing it in general. Okay? And spent fuel will be disposed of in the same way in deep geological formations if it is not reprocessed to recover the unused uranium. A lot of member states, strangely enough from our Eurobarometer surveys, a lot of member states have the perception that sea dumping is still taking place, and that's including people in the UK believe we still dump radioactive waste into the sea. Okay, this actually stopped in 1982 under the London Dumping Convention. So for over 33 years now there's been no dumping of radioactive waste in the seas. 8 out of 10 people in Denmark, in the Netherlands and in Sweden believe that their waste is exported for disposal. Now, Denmark doesn't really produce any radioactive waste apart from little bits for medical uses, and they don't export that, it's stored. The Netherlands and Sweden produce radioactive waste but do not export it. No European country at the present time exports its radioactive waste. It might send some to different countries to be treated and things like this, but it's only gone for a short period of time before it's been returned. Only 1 person in 8 realised that a large majority of the low-level waste has already been disposed of. Only 1 in 8 realised that we have been disposing of radioactive waste for a long time already. And 72% of the population believe there's no way to do it. And if you add the 14% don't know, that's only 14% think we can do something about it. So basically people don't think we can do anything with the waste and they're worried about it. This is why waste is such a critical issue for the nuclear problem. Until 1982, seabed disposal was frequently used. We used to take it out to sea and drop it through, actually a special hole in the bottom of the special boat, and straight into the sea in concrete containers. But now low and intermediate level waste is routinely, and I say routinely, it happens every day, disposed of in near surface and shallow surface disposal sites. Very extensively in the UK and France in particular, but also in a number of other countries, the Czech Republic, Finland, Hungary, Slovakia, Sweden, Spain. But all waste in the Netherlands is currently stored in one building. They've got this beautiful big building. It's brightly painted orange, I think, at the moment in time, that they store all their radioactive waste. All of the member states with nuclear power plants are expected to have repositories, i.e. disposal sites, for low-level and intermediate-level waste by 2020. Plus Denmark and Latvia, they will have disposal sites, though they don't have nuclear power programs, purely to dispose of the medical sources that are used for radiomedical treatment. But only Finland and Sweden have confirmed sites for high-level waste disposal. And France expects to take a decision later this year on its site, but I think there's nobody who works in the nuclear sector will question the fact as to where the French site will be. I think we've all seen where it's going to go. We know exactly where it's going to go in France. That's the source of the information. I put it up there for people who wish to check on this data afterwards, look at a lot more data, the information in detail. Right, so those of you who don't know anything, never seen these things before, this is the UK's main low-level waste repository. It says near Drigg in Cumbria. It's very close, it's right close to Sellafield. And this is this UK's low-level waste repository. I told you about 2 million tonnes have been disposed of already. Well, here's over 1 million tonnes of it. 1 million cubic metres of it. Most of it is under the grass on the left-hand side now. Most of it is in that bit at the left, and the newer part is the part on the right which has not yet been covered over. So that's at Drigg in the UK. You can, as I say, a lot of this stuff you can just put in normal sites. This is also in the UK. And you see it, this is containers. These are typical low-level waste containers, or very low-level waste containers. You can just put in like ISO containers. You quite often see these on the backs of lorries on the motorways. You probably have radiation stickers on them, but you'll see them on the backs of lorries. And they'll be going for disposal at one of the sites. And they just lower it in, and you can see the man up there in front of the crane. He's climbing up the ladder to walk on top of the container. These are no special precautions needed. This is very low. This is low or very low level waste, and it's a short half-life. There's no particular surveillance necessary at all. It can be disposed of with other sorts of household waste, as you see there. This is the Centre de la Monge in France. This is a low-level waste repository that opened in 1969 and actually closed 25 years later. But it was full, and over 500,000 cubic metres of low-level waste has been disposed of there, and it's been grassed over and covered over, and there's a helicopter pad on top and roads around it, and surveillance. It's now surveillance and monitoring, and it will be monitored and surveyed for the next 150, 250 years maybe, until they're convinced there's no damage from it at all. This is near Cherbourg in France. This is the new French site. Now the other one was closed, this one is open. This is designed to take 100 million cubic metres of low and intermediate level waste over the next 60 years. This is a similar place. It's smaller in Spain because Spain produces less radioactive waste than the French do. The French is the major producer now because they have by far the largest program. This is the Spanish program, and the two kind of covers at the end are what they work under. These are not all full. These are built as concrete boxes, effectively, with lids on. And what you do is you go under the covers. They take the cover off when they're working on it, slide that big mobile tent over the top. Then the people don't get wet and the water doesn't get in if it rains. And they put the waste in these, and after that they'll put the cover back on. And if it's not full, then it depends on the type of waste. They put different waste in different ones of these big concrete boxes. And so when they fill it, once it's all full, they will grass it all over and build some more somewhere else if they need it. That's also one that's partly full, and they're just kind of putting some, they're obviously filling the gaps with this kind of earth between to fill up, to give it better support, structural support, rather than just leave gaps in the middle of it. This is what the Finns do with their low and intermediate level waste. They don't do surface storage, they do subsurface storage. So they put it down underground, they put it about 50 or 60 metres down. This is the Loviisa, this is a picture, the diagram of the Loviisa power plant in Finland. And these are this is the underground storage at Loviisa. You put it down a shaft and then you keep it underground. All the waste from all the low and intermediate level waste from that power plant will be stored at that site. And this is the same site at Olkiluoto, another finished reactor, and this is the low and intermediate level waste store, and basically you just push it in here, you use the crane to lower it down into the kind of silo, concrete silo they have, and just keep filling it up, and they're still filling up the first 2 silos. Again, you don't see people, it's empty apart from people taking the photographs, me in this case. So. What we do with the high level waste, this 190 cubic meters we have of it, we can't just keep, because it's in a liquid form, mainly a liquid form, and we can't keep it in a liquid form for long. The Russians tried to, and they had quite a large explosion of it, which contaminated a reasonable size of parts of Siberia. So we don't try and do that. We try and put it in a solid form where it's much more stable, and the solid form in which it can be then disposed of. So what we do, the blue line is the liquid waste coming in. We add some glass to it. We infuse it together in the glass, stirred up as well at the same time, and then we run it into what I would refer to as milk churns. You know what a milk churn is? It's the things used to carry large quantities of milk in. They're about this high, they're about this wide, made out of a special stainless steel for the waste. We put the molten glass into here, let it solidify, and then weld on a top onto it so it's completely contained. Check that the outside is clean. You don't want the outside dirty. Make sure if it's clean, we have to clean it up, and then we put it in these tubes underground, specially constructed out of the blue material is concrete, special strong concrete. I'm not a civil engineer, so if the civil engineers here, they'll know what it is. I don't. And then we stack them up in these tubes underground, and then put the lid on the top. You can walk on the top of this quite easily. I've got quite a few pictures from walking on the tops of all this high-level waste, but you leave it there till it cools down, because it's still producing heat. It's still, these fission products in the waste are still decaying and still giving out heat, and till it cools down, and then you can dispose of it. So this is the sort of thing that is done. This is a French program. This is a French slide, obviously, but the same process is used at Thorpe and Sellafield. What do we do with the spent fuel? This is, by the way, is a fuel rod, it's called. These are fuel pellets. These pellets are about less than an inch long and less than half an inch diameter, and they go inside a tube, a cladding tube, and stack them up. You can carry these around in your hand. You can pick them up like this, it's no problem. And then you put it in an assembly where you assemble them all together. This is a spent fuel rod, effectively. Spent fuel assembly. Once they've been used, you put it inside an iron case, and then you seal it in a copper canister. The reason for copper canister is that copper can exist in nature underground without changing its form. We can find native copper that was deposited 1 million years ago, which is still native copper, unchanged. So it's resistant to erosion and can keep the waste inside the container. Then we take the container down, put it in a hole in the ground, well underground, usually 500 meters, and this is the Swedish case. 500 meters underground, you dig a hole in the granite, put the container in, this copper canister with all the spent fuel inside, put bentonite round it, pack it bentonite round it. Bentonite is a clay which swells when it gets wet, so it stops any more water coming in. So it's a good way to stop water getting into the canister at all, to getting near the canister. And then we backfill the hole where we've done all the work, and then we close the shaft eventually. And that's the same thing is done in Finland. This is the Finnish model. It's just the same. We use exactly the same technology. They're going to dispose of the spent fuel directly, but you can do exactly the same thing with the high-level waste. You can put it in these vertical tubes round with bentonite and backfill, or you can put it in a horizontal tube with bentonite and backfill. So you can do the same thing with the spent fuel or the high-level waste. You can put the same two in the same repository, no problem. And this is what it's. This is the Onkalo repository in Finland. This is well advanced now. You see the brown line, which takes us down to depth. This is the depth now, the right depth at which they plan to do the disposal. They're using it presently, doing lots of experiments on it to make sure the rock is suitable, and then they will start the full construction of all the parts of the repository ready to put the spent fuel in, and this is the repository that will be used for all of the Finnish nuclear fuel and waste, high-level waste, for the future. All of it will go into one hole. And that's all you get on the surface. This is the Onkalo site. I said they're down to depth now. They've pretty well. And this is, we'll never get much more than this on the surface. There's an entry to the shaft. You can just see it to the left of the green building. There's a shaft that's built and goes down on the ground for the 450, I think, meters in Finland. And then it will just disappear. So, the message is, safe management of radioactive waste is a vital step in public perception. You need the public to understand about radioactive waste and not to be worried about radioactive waste if don't want to be worried about nuclear. And an apparent lack of progress has had a negative influence on the perception of the nuclear option. A lot of people, the majority of people, are against nuclear because of the waste problem. In those countries where nuclear has been openly debated and discussed, there's a greater public acceptance. So where people have talked about it, more people have accepted it. And informing the public and involving them in the decision-making process is not only very important to do, but now it's a legal requirement to do. Everybody has to involve the public in the decision-making about siting of a repository and about any sort of large nuclear facility, whether it's a repository or a reprocessing plant or a new power plant. They've got to involve the public in the decision-making process, otherwise they can be taken to court, as the UK government found out to its cost a few years ago when it failed to do a strategic environmental assessment and consult the public on its idea to launch a new nuclear power program. So why nuclear? It's a secure form of energy with a very, very low risk of any supply interruption. So it gives us security of supply. It's able to provide electricity at a relatively low and a very stable cost. The cost of nuclear electricity, once it's producing the electricity of a nuclear power plant, it can produce it for 60 years for about the same cost, because the price of its fuel is almost irrelevant. The price of the uranium that is used to fuel it is so small in comparison to the rest of the cost that it doesn't matter. It doesn't influence the cost hardly at all. So it makes it competitive. It has very low emissions and does not contribute to global warming. It also has potentially a very long life. Once you've built a nuclear power plant, you've got it for 60 years or longer. And because we can continue to produce enough uranium for many years to come, nuclear power can run well into following centuries. Even with our present technology, we've got a long lifetime, but with new technologies burning less and less uranium, we can make it live for much longer. So it's sustainable. So it meets all three of the criteria. In fact, nuclear is the only 24/7, available 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, 52 weeks a year, energy source that meets all three energy challenges at the same time. No other energy source meets the same challenges, all three challenges at the same time. Not one. Renewables, yes, good for security of supply, at least some of the time. If the wind's blowing or the sun's shining, fine, it's good. So it can't be interrupted by other people. Sustainable, of course, but it's not always competitive. Coal, yes, security of supply, if your supply is not interrupted on your imports. Same for gas. How secure is our gas supply? Is it going to remain competitive if the Russians control the taps? And of course, coal and gas both produce large amounts of carbon dioxide, as does oil, so it's not really sustainable. Nuclear is the only 24/7 energy source that meets all three energy challenges, and the only issue for many people is the waste issue. And I believe, hopefully, you will also believe, if you think about it, that we can manage that. So, thank you very much for listening. If you have any questions, I'd be more than happy to try and answer them.
Okay, we do it on the microphone, so then we can put it on a podcast as well.
I have a question about the half-life.
If you could raise the microphone a bit.
Sorry. The half-life time for the high-level waste material that get buried down in the ground, how long does it take for this to dissolve? And what about the footprint in case of a leakage? Well, we don't know if there is going to be one or not.
I don't have a slide with me on the half-life of the different wastes. Of course, the high-level waste is made up of a number of different nuclides, and they have different half-lives. But the main thing about it is, of course, that the half-lives are quite long. If they're very short, we wouldn't need to bury them, and they would decay to nothing very quickly. So these are high-level waste usually has a long half-life, so they live a very long time, so they remain dangerous for a long time. And but there's a mixture of them, so some die off quicker than others. In the past, we used to work on the idea that we should aim to isolate for 100,000 years. That was the idea. That's why you go very deep, because nobody's going to build a store on the surface and near the surface that they can say will last 100,000 years. But if you put it a kilometre down underground, you're putting it in rocks which are millions of years old, often 50, 60, 100 million, or 600 million years old plus in the case of Finland and Scandinavia, anywhere in Scandinavia. So you're putting it in very old rocks, and the chances of it escaping are reduced, very significantly reduced, of course, by the distance from the surface. High-level waste, we always say about high-level waste is that it's as secure as its strongest barrier. So the best barrier determines the length of time. And so nothing, if you've got one barrier that will last 1,000,000 years, then it doesn't matter what the other barriers, and we have 7 barriers for high-level waste, the different containers it goes in, the bentonite around it, the rock around that, and then its distance from the surface. If it escapes, now we work, I say we used to work on 100,000 years. Then Sweden, because it's kind of very environmentally conscious, and in order to convince the public that it was safe, they insisted that waste sites in Finland, high-level waste sites, be secure for 1,000,000 years. It's very difficult to prove it's going to be secure 1,000,000 years, but all the studies are now you kind of down to the possibility of something like less than 1 death in 1,000,000 years' time caused by this high-level waste repository, and that's the sort of target they aim for, and the sort of thing they say they can believe is to be the case. But I say it's very difficult to actually prove it's going to happen in 1,000,000 years, even 1 kilometre down. But the chances of a significant leakage, that it's going to reach the surface, and when it reaches the surface starting to impact on the environment, so low it's virtually zero. But you can't, I say, it's one thing, it's very impossible to prove a negative, so, and this is a negative in many ways, that it's not going to impact anybody. I hope that answers the question. There are lots of things published on the lifetimes of the waste and the possibilities and all the different analyses that have been done on it. Lots and lots of studies have been done, and there's a lot of information available out there if you wish to pursue it.
Derek, the recognised powerhouse of Europe, Germany, has decided to put up its energy costs by closing its nuclear plant. I mean, you've given a very, very reasonable explanation as to why nuclear should be considered as maybe a primary source of electricity. Why would a country like that decide to almost go backwards and reduce its economic advantage by taking that step?
Basically because it's a political decision, obviously. But it was a political decision taken in Germany. Basically when you had the Red-Green Alliance, it was called in around the year 2000, and the Environment Minister, who was one of the Green Party in the German politics, they always have a coalition governments in Germany, the Red-Green coalition, so you had the left plus the Greens together, and the leader was Mr. Trittin, who was the Environment Minister, and he was very strongly anti-nuclear, and he basically pushed through the parties. The Reds had to agree to keep the Greens on side on a nuclear phase-out. This was in 2000. So it was agreed that they would phase out basically by 2022. When the politics changed and Mrs. Merkel came to power, she couldn't completely reverse it because public opinion was still reasonably strongly against nuclear in Germany, because I say once you get politicians say we should close it down, the public tend to swing behind the view it should be closed. Mrs. Merkel came to power and public opinion was still relatively negative, but they took the decision to prolong the lives of the existing reactors. The decision was to give life extensions to existing nuclear power plants. And this is where it was going to go, and with the hope that eventually they would go with the idea of finally we'll get rid of this law after a few years, and because it'll be redundant and we'll continue the nuclear program. And that was, I think, what everybody expected to happen, and then Fukushima happened. And immediately there was a loud outcry in Germany about the nuclear power program, and the decision was taken purely as a result of Fukushima because of a 12-meter tsunami in Japan to close all the nuclear power plants in Germany by 2022 again. And that was it. And it was purely because the kind of gut feeling of the German public at the time. It was coming up to an election, so we'd better keep the public happy, and we agreed to close everything again. And it's never been reversed, and it may not be reversed. I keep hoping it will, but